Hello everyone, and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. This is my first top 10 of fiction. A couple of months after I started this channel, I made two videos presenting my best books of all time. This top 22 included non-fiction and fiction. I also included Dutch books that had not been translated into English. My goal at the time was to take a snapshot of my all-time favorite books before fantasy was about to mess that up. At that point, I had been reading fantasy for about 5 months. Being new to the genre, it didn't feel right to include any fantasy at that time, not really knowing yet where to place them. That is almost 2 years ago now. Now, having read more than 100 fantasy books, I believe I can make my top 10 in the overall genre of fiction. So non-fiction and no untranslated Dutch books, because the latter don't mean anything to about 99% of my audience. My only other rule is that each author can only make one appearance on this list. Let's jump right in. Number 10. Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. Right away, the first fantasy entry to this list. I read this one in September of 2024. It is the second book in the Stormlight archive, next to the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the Wheel of Time, one of the most ambitious fantasy series ever. So far, the first arc of 5 books has been published and another 5 are planned. They are extremely thick books, ranging from 384,000 words for the first book, The Way of Kings, to almost 488,000 words for Wind and Truth, the final installment. Keep in mind that the average novel has about 85,000 words. I love this book, but I have to explain that I awarded each of the 3 books I've read in this series with 97 points out of 100. So to me, they are equally superb. This is the one doing the honors here, perhaps because of the many booktubers who named this one as their favorite of the bunch. However, actually I chose Words of Radiance here because of one small chapter in the book, a so-called interlude, which features the enigmatic shoemaker Im. To me, the 9 pages of this chapter stand out between the 1300 plus of the book, which shows that it's not about how thick a book is, but about the quality of what's on the pages. Every book and the series as a whole is epic in scope. The story is complex and compelling, and the mystery behind all the events is intriguing. Like no other, Sanderson understands the art of dosage. He gives the reader just enough to keep on turning the pages. I love his character work. For instance, how the relationship between 2 main characters, Kaladin and Adolin, changes. But also how Kaladin as a person or Dalinar as a person develops throughout the story. Also, this is a book where for the first time the Cosmere as the grander universe comes into view. If you want to hear me rave about this book for more than an hour, you can check out my reading vlog. Links of all the videos that I mention here are also in the description below. This series, or the 3 books I've read so far, to me is fantasy at its best. It won't be long till I pick up book number 4, Rhythm of War. Number 9. The Labyrinth of the Spirits by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. I read this book in February of 2019 in a Dutch translation, and its 845 pages are an immensely memorable ending to the 4-book series called The Cemetery of Forgotten Books. This is one of those books that only gets better in my memory as time passes. Some books can do that with you. There is another one later on in this video that also keeps on getting better in my mind. So, as this one ripens in my memory, it keeps on stealing places in my ranking. In terms of language, style, story, history, humour, wit, wisdom and composition, Zafón has once again proven his mastership. Everything that is being set up in the previous books falls into place in this epic closure in a sublime and convincing way. For a language freak like myself, every page is an absolute delight, and I'm sorry that I cannot read it in its original language, Spanish. I simply couldn't stop underlining sentences and entire paragraphs because of the rich linguistic brilliance. In particular, every scene with the enigmatic character of Fermin Romero de Torres is higher art in writing. Next to the family chronicle, the reader learns a lot about the Spanish Civil War and the subsequent Franco regime. But there is also a mystery and a political thriller inside of this book. The complexity of the story with its multiple threads nowhere becomes burdensome. Of the many positives, what stands out the most for me is the reverence for writers and their work we feel on every page. This is aptly expressed when little Julian, son of Daniel Sempere, is first taken to the cemetery of forgotten books. The father whispers to his son, "Every book, every volume you see contains souls. The soul of the one who wrote it and the soul of those who read it and dreamt about it." I take a deep bow for this master who passed away much too soon. Number 8. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This second fantasy book on the list was my book of the year 2024. I read this short novel in May of last year, and I cannot stop thinking about it until today. I cannot say very much about it without spoiling anything. It is therefore no surprise that my video on this book was filled with spoilers. Not only is the book set in a maze, the plot of the book itself is a maze. And with each page, the reader advances further into the mystery and can see around another corner. That's about as far as I can go into the story, really. I am in awe of Susanna Clarke's craftsmanship and her rich and profound imagination. Right after finishing this read, I was very enthusiastic, but I didn't really know how to rate this book. After some consideration, I realized that apart from a few minuscule twists that I found to be a little bit unrealistic, this book is just perfect, which makes it a rightful holder of the 8th spot in my top 10. Her writing skills have convinced me to buy her other book, which is a big one. I hope I'll come around to reading Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell this year. Number 7. Kafka on the Beach by Haruki Murakami. This book of literary fiction is my favorite of all the books I've read of this author. Even with the other genres contending, this book held 3rd place on my top 22 in 2023. The fact that it has dropped to 7th place is not because I've altered my admiration for this book. Books rarely turn sour in my memory. No, there are simply some fantasy books that honestly deserve a higher spot. But that doesn't take anything away of my love for this surrealistic and beautiful book. This novel, which I read in December of 2010, tells several stories that at first sight seem totally unrelated. The 15-year-old Kafka Tamura runs away from home. His father has cursed him. One day you'll murder your father with your own hands. One day you'll lie down with your mother. A true Oedipus. His mother left the family when he was very young, taking away his sister. Kafka cannot even remember his mother. The young boy sets out on a quest to find his mother and sister. A second story in the book revolves around Nakata, an older man who talks about himself in 3rd person. As a kid, Nakata experienced an unexplained incident where all children of his school class during a field trip through the woods passed out. They all regained consciousness fairly quickly, except for Nakata. After weeks in a coma, he awoke, having lost his intelligence. From the best student in the class, he spiraled into an extremely low IQ. His head was empty, literally. He had returned to the world as the proverbial tabula rasa. Nowadays, Nakata can talk to cats, which is not an uncommon feature in Murakami's books. The lives of other characters are narrated, and the storylines of Kafka and Nakata develop continually. A strongly surrealistic event prompts Nakata to go on a journey. He doesn't know where he has to go, only that he simply has to. In a believable and very well-crafted turn of events, all the different stories come together. Of course, I will not reveal if the prophecy of Kafka's father will come true. At the core, this book touches upon the great questions of life. For me, the most important question the writer tries to explore in this book is whether you as a human being want to remember your whole life, or that you would rather forget everything. Memories make you feel warmer inside, but at the same time they also tear you to pieces from the inside out. This choice was made for Nakata, but Kafka has to choose on his own volition. This book is an absolute masterpiece. It is a perfect composition with truly profound plot twists. It is obvious that I highly recommend this book. Number 6. Heir of Nofron by Michael J. Sullivan. This is another one of those rare books that keep getting better every time I think back on it. The third fantasy book on this list. I read its 928 pages in March of 2023 when I was about 2 months underway in my journey into fantasy. All 3 books in the Rieria Revelations, which was originally self-published in 6 volumes, are superb. Despite their length, in total they cover more than 2,300 pages, they read very quick and easy, which is one of the things that put me on the wrong foot. I have been conditioned for many years believing that a book that reads easily can hardly be a good book as well, which, as I understand now, is a load of... The bromance between the 2 main characters, Royce and Hadrian, sets the norm for me. The banter between the 2 is the best I have yet come across in fantasy, and the story is told masterfully. The character work is superbly done, especially in the case of Princess Arista, who during the trilogy transforms from a spoiled girl of noble birth into a wise, loving and courageous sorceress. And the most lovable character in all of fantasy simply has to be Myron, the monk. He is a textbook example of how wisdom and naivety go hand in hand. This third book is such a perfect ending to the series. The final pages bring one of the storylines to such a tender and beautiful close as I have not yet read in any other book. Still, to this day, thinking back on that ending brings a big smile on my face. They firmly established my reverence for this author. Strangely, I haven't read anything by this author in 2024. The books in Sullivan's Rieria Chronicles that take place before the events in the Revelations are on my TBR for this year, but from what I understand about the preferred reading order, I should read the first 3 books in his Legend of the First Empire after The Rose and the Thorn. I don't own those books yet. And as I'm on a Read What You Own challenge at the moment, that won't work. Unless, of course, I break my own promise of not buying new books for half a year. It's not easy being a booktuber in the fantasy genre. Number 5. Fateless by Imre Kertész. I read this book 22 and a half years ago in this Dutch translation, and still it deserves to be in my top 5 of best fiction books of all time. It is written by Imre Kertész, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2002. Kertész miraculously survived the Nazi concentration camps during World War II. I remember that after I'd finished reading the final pages of this book, I cried for about 10 minutes. It's because of the beauty and the way the author gives meaning to the mind-boggling great suffering his main character experiences. The book is an almost emotionless description of his year in the concentration camps of the Nazis. In the beginning, the lack of emotion bothered me. In the last chapter, the main character describes his homecoming. There he has two conversations, one with a journalist and another with two of his neighbors. The journalist urges him to make his experience in the Nazi camps known to the world, while his neighbors advise him to forget everything and start his life anew. They don't understand or cannot understand his argument that he doesn't want to forget, even assuming that he could, and that he must continue his life as it is or die after all. This last chapter offered me a new way of looking at how survivors deal with the Holocaust. The main character makes a unique existentialistic effort. He cannot possibly believe that it was mere fate that directed him into his experience. Every shred of faith in fate diminishes true freedom. So he strongly believes in free will and in making his own choices, even when these choices led him to the horrors of the Nazi camps. In the end, he maintains that it was his own choice to wait at that bus stop where the Germans arrested him. It was his own choice to aggravate one of the camp brutes, which led to being beaten almost to death. Accepting his own responsibility in all he has been through is the only way for the main character to keep on living, to find a way to continue while his memories keep haunting him. The realization of the immensity of suffering that can make people take such an extreme view on things is what made me cry. That is exactly one of the reasons why his memories are written down in such a matter-of-fact way. They go beyond any possible understanding of what this suffering truly means. The absence of emotions of any kind is required in order to be able to write them down. Any book that can provoke such a strong emotional response deserves praise. Kertész's Nobel Prize was a rightful recognition of his mastery as a writer. Number 4. The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan. Having converted my reading beliefs to the genre of fantasy in January of 2023, I got off to a blitzing start with reading The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Within a period of 2 months, I read the first 5 books in the series, along with a couple of other chunkers. For me, The Great Hunt, the second volume, still remains the best of all 15 books in the series. Although The Eye of the World, Book 1, The Dragon Reborn, Book 3, and Lord of Chaos, Book 6, come real close. Here you can see my ratings of all the books in the series, with books 8 and 10 confirming that I too experienced the notorious slog. Still, I believe that the impact of this huge epic fantasy series can hardly be overrated. Even with the lesser books, I thoroughly enjoyed this whole experience, which started on January 16 of 2023 and ended at the end of May, 1 year later. While reading this series, I realized that I was undergoing an initiation, a rebirth into the genre of fantasy. The magic I received in my earlier years, reading The Lord of the Rings and the Duncton series by William Hallwood, I now received from The Wheel of Time. It has been a first experience, which impact, like all true first experiences, will never fade. There is nothing about The Great Hunt that I didn't like. Being the second book, I already was somewhat familiar with the huge world, its background, and the main characters. Jordan very slowly reveals the whole tapestry, and you have to pay very close attention. I also loved the many ceremonial scenes that take place in the White Tower in the city of Tarvalon. Even though this is not my favorite fantasy book on the list, it and The Wheel of Time as a whole will remain my basis of reference within this genre. The whole concept of the Wheel of Time weaving threads is what fascinates me the most in these books. Of course, the story in The Great Hunt is captivating and intriguing, and the destiny some of the characters are facing is beautiful. But what really gets to me is the unlikely way the woven threads touch each other and influence the pattern. It is as if the meaning of life becomes irrelevant. Honorable mentions. I could easily make this the longest section of this video, but I won't. You can imagine that in 45 years of reading, I've gathered some amazing books. Let me just name 3 of them. First, The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This is a very strange book at first glance. To begin with, the narrator is Death in person, who tells the story of Liesel Memminger during World War II. Liesel is the book thief from the title. Everything in that book revolves around words. On a wall in her basement, Liesel paints the words she doesn't understand. Once she understands them, she paints them over. Her family hides the Jewish Max Vandenberg. The book is filled with heartbreaking scenes and it overflows with symbolism and excels in language discoveries. Nowhere does it get sentimental, and yet my eyes remained moist for the last 15 pages. Few books are so good that they can pull this off. This author has given humanity a gem in words with The Book Thief. Want to know more? Watch my video dedicated to this book. His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. All right, 3 books in one, but I couldn't possibly pick one of them. Northern Lights, The Subtle Knife and The Amber Spyglass together tell one of the most intriguing stories I have ever come across, filled with important life lessons and insights. In the world of Lyra Belacqua, the main protagonist, humans are attached to their demons. Women have a male animal counterpart and men have a female animal for demon. Although in parallel worlds, people have no such thing as a demon. There is the Magisterium, a group of power-hungry religious fanatics, and there is Lord Asriel, who is determined to break their grip on the world. I think the HBO adaptation of this series did a pretty good job, but the books are much more detailed and intricate in the world building and storytelling. The adventures of Lyra are rich in every possible way. Stranger in a Strange Land, Robert A. Heinlein. I read this book back in 2011, and it was one of my first Heinlein reads. Within the next 5 years, I read almost his entire works. Stranger in a Strange Land was first published in 1961, and it breaks with many taboos, and the author doesn't hesitate to sacrifice many sacred cows. The story is about Valentine Michael Smith, who, as the first and only human, grew up on Mars. When coming to Earth, he literally is a stranger in a strange land. Many ways of thinking and feeling distinguish him from other humans. For one, he has learned to use his brain capacity to the fullest. This book is one of the most provoking science fiction stories I've ever read. Plus, it features one of my favorite characters, the enigmatic and annoying Jubal Harshaw. Number 3. The Secret Magdalene by Kai Longfellow. I read this outstanding book of literary fiction in March of 2009. Kai Longfellow instantly became one of my favorite authors. Rarely have I underlined more sentences in a book than I did in this special novel. The story, in short, is a retelling of the life of Jehoshua, Jeshu the Nazarene, who we know better as Jesus. The story is told from the perspective of Mariamne Magdalene, who we know as Mary Magdalene. The language in this novel is beautiful, poetic, and masterful. Society around the beginning of our era is very realistically drawn. Also, the book has a deeply philosophical trait. In Longfellow's story, Yeshu is a human being who feels the need to share his Gnostic insight with all people. This insight is expressed as follows. God is not a being outside the self, nor has it gender, nor is it burdened with a desire to find fault or to test or a need to command obedience. God is consciousness, which is all there is. Because it is not easy to get the people's attention for his message, Yeshu ultimately sees no other way than to have himself proclaimed Messiah, King. In the book, he is called the God-man of the Jewish people, the representative of God on earth. Yeshu does not believe at all that he truly is all this, but he sees no other way to get through to the people. The entire narrative of how Yeshu got sentenced to death and his ascension 3 days later presents us with a completely new perspective on this story that has so strongly shaped our society. It would be spoiling things if I told you how masterfully the author brings her story to a conclusion. The many explanations of biblical events in this book are ingenious, and all of them are plausible. I won't go into the many profound interpretations and quotes that makes this book such a rich read. If you like to hear more in-depth material, please check out my separate video about this unforgettable book. Number 2. On second place, I have 2 books. I know this is cheating, but I honestly cannot rate one above the other. They are 2 recent reads in the fantasy genre. Even though both books belong to fantasy, they are very different from another. They both scored the exceptional 100 points out of 100. Those of you who follow my channel know already which 2 are coming up. First we have The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I read The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss just last month in March. This was one of my most anticipated reads for this year, and other than Abercrombie's First Law, this anticipation fully delivered on its promise. Only a couple of chapters into this book, I knew I was holding gold in my hands. The writing of Pat Rothfuss is top level, not overly flowery, while polished to the utmost detail. He is an absolute master of touching the inner emotional strings of the reader, not only with the story, but also with his exquisite prose and metaphors. The book is structured like a play within a play within a play. On the first level, we are in the here and now with the innkeeper called Coate and his alleged pupil or apprentice called Bast. Some strange and creepy events take place, which hint at the fact that magic and dark forces are at play here, but we don't know what or how. In that story, the innkeeper starts telling his life story to someone called Chronicler. Each leg of his story, which is level 2, takes about 1 day to tell, and as we know, there are 3 days to cover in total. Within this story, we are treated to a couple of other stories, level 3. Normally I'm not such a huge fan of these kind of structures, but in this case it works remarkably well. With many books, I feel the need to pause before continuing with a new chapter. With The Name of the Wind there is no thought at all, and I realize 1 or 2 pages in that I've started reading a new chapter already. So it reads very easily. At the moment I am reading the second book, A Wise Man's Fear, which is 1100 plus pages long, but the length of the novel is no issue at all. You breeze through it. Some characters in The Name of the Wind really have stolen my heart, like the tender Trappist, who takes care of outcast children. I also adored Ori, a poetic character in the book. This small and mysterious girl regards all inanimate things as sentient, or at least endowed with special abilities. This book made me shift emotions from laughing out loud to shedding tears and being deeply touched by the beauty in a matter of a few pages. Like this one small chapter, it's not even one full page, where Rothfuss describes that magical moment of silence after the music has ended. I have been to many concerts in my life, and every time when the final notes of a piece have died away into silence, there is this ethereal nothingness where I always held my breath and hoped for it to last just a bit longer before applause would do its disruptive work. That is perfectly described in this short chapter. This book represents everything I love in fantasy. The other book in second place is A Song for Arbonne by Guy Gavriel Kay. I read this book in January of this year. I titled my video about this book The Best Fantasy Book Ever, but that was before I read The Name of the Wind. In the land of Arbonne, which looks a lot like medieval Provence or Languedoc, arts like music and poetry are highly revered. The matriarchal society has a deep veneration for the goddess Radiance, who embodies love and beauty. A long-standing feud between two dukes plays throughout the whole story. There is political intrigue and cultural and religious differences that in the end lead to conflict with Gouraud, a country north of Arbonne. A lot of our real history regarding the prosecutions of Cathars and of the role of the troubadours resonates in A Song for Arbonne. The first 100 to 150 pages of the book are a bit slow. There is no real main protagonist or antagonist. Several characters just inhabit the pages with nothing much of importance happening, or so it seems. The reader is kept in the dark as to what the real story is about. The story certainly holds promise, but there is not much direction to speak of. Nevertheless, the prose is simply magical. In just a few words, GGK is able to capture a feeling rich in experience and authenticity. At the end of part 1, I was still sort of waiting for the story to truly kick in, but I enjoyed my reading time. Gradually, the book started to overwhelm me. There are also many very strong, beautiful and sharp dialogues. The ending of this book is simply perfect. Everything, the big threads as well as the smaller loose threads, come together. From the 5 books I now have read by this author, I dare to conclude that Guy Gavriel Kay does not write easy books. They require concentration, especially if you want to savor all the elements like the poetic prose, the immaculate world building, the character development and the profound story. With A Song for Arbonne, the author has written a monument in words, honoring the ancient troubadour tradition. It is also a tribute to the courageous drive for leading an autonomous way of life in memory of the so-called Cathars in the south of France. During my read of A Song for Arbonne, I have cried, I was angry, even furious at times. I laughed out loud. I was touched by beautiful rituals and poetry, and I could feel the love some of the characters feel for one another. In short, this is a perfect book for me. It represents everything I love in fantasy. Number 1. On first place in my top 10 fiction is a book that is nowhere mentioned on YouTube, BookTube. Nowhere. At least I haven't been able to find one video where it is mentioned. I'm talking about Skallagrig by William Horwood. Even though I have read some amazingly good books since I started reading fantasy, none of them can top my best fiction book of all time. Skallagrig by William Horwood was published in 1987. Unfortunately, Skallagrig has mostly been forgotten by now, and to me that is a crying shame. This book deserves so much more recognition than it has ever received. True, it has been adapted for a TV movie produced by the BBC back in 1994, but that didn't do much for its longevity. On the one hand, I can see why the book never got to be an all-time bestseller. For one, The title, Scalagrig, is weird. It has no meaning and cannot be interpreted in any way. It wouldn't surprise me if the publisher back then had a hearty word about this with the author, trying to persuade him to choose a title that people can relate to. Then, at the heart of the story features a girl and boy with cerebral palsy. Not quite the kind of heroes people would instantly fall for. Also, if one had conquered those two obvious barriers and picked up the book, the beginning of the novel is a little bit confusing, to say the least. I was lucky enough to have read the earlier works by this author and didn't hesitate for 1 second to start this novel, which turned out to be nothing less than an absolute masterpiece. The story features Esther Marquand, who is born in a spastic body. She cannot speak or walk, but she is highly intelligent. She struggles with questions and with the heavy task of fully accepting life in the form it has been given to her. That is a quest with many, many hard passages and roadblocks. From the start, the writer prepares the reader and himself for the worst. How far must we continue this journey before we can begin to experience the unimaginable, namely, what it must be like to be Esther ourselves? The novel is way too complex to do justice here in this short mention, but the complexity is nowhere hindering the reader from getting fully immersed into the search several of the characters undertake. A search for a missing person enshrouded in myth, the search for love, the search for meaning, the search for friendship, and for self-acceptance. Esther is the creator of the computer game called Scalagrig. This is how the game begins. You are a parent, and your daughter has just been born. The doctor says if she lives, she may never walk, nor talk, nor pick up an object freely. She may, I'm afraid, be blind. She may be subnormal. I'm so sorry. Imagine you have power over her of life or death. You let her live. Type L for live. You let her die. Type D for die. The novel takes us deep into the harsh reality of the mental institutions back in the 1920s, where disabled people were literally discarded. It's about 50 years later that Esther researches the archives and the stories that are told within the disabled community about the Scalagrig. Eventually she finds the person who started spreading the Scalagrig stories. Even after she has answered all her questions about the Scalagrig, Esther still hasn't found her own inner peace. She then creates the computer game, which in a way is her attempt to accept that she will never be able to pick up an object freely, and that she will never be able to make her grief directly understandable to others. If the player is able to unravel the final anagrams, he gets to the heart of the game and of the book. Life is usually a self-made maze whose walls are fear and prejudice. A maze through which there is no perfect route, whose final stages demand acceptance of weakness, not display of strength. In the end, strength lies in acceptance. Peace cannot be in craving, but in the giving up of desire. Even now, almost 40 years after having read them for the first time, I believe these to be the most powerful and profound words any novel has ever offered me. All the different explorations and searches in the book come to an extremely emotional but satisfying close. In over 700 pages, Horwood lays out a story that is extraordinary. It's a story that, as one of the blurbs at the back of the book claims, would wring tears from a stone. It isn't fair to compare this top 10 with my top 22 of almost 2 years ago, but it's amazing to me to find that now more than half of the books belong to the fantasy genre. Books whose ranking were set in stone, or so I thought, have dropped, or have even disappeared out of my top 10. Things are obviously in motion, and to me, That's a good thing. It means I am reinventing myself as a reader and that I'm not stuck in the past. If I reduce my 2023 list to 10 books, eliminate the non-fiction and the Dutch books, and allow only one book per author, it would have looked like this. Six of these books have disappeared. Three of the remaining four switched places. And with the new entries of 6 new fantasy books and 1 literary fiction, that makes my top 10 fiction for 2025. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.